Hello and welcome to the first ever Great Northwest Days podcast. We are recording this in January of 2026, right ahead of our visit to the state capitol in on February 3rd and 4th, 2026. And we're excited to bring you a preview of the priorities and what to expect from Great Northwest Days. My name is Joe Hageman. I'm the Director of Community Relations at United Fiber, and I'm also the chairman for the steering committee that puts on Great Northwest Days. With me, I also have Kim Millward. Kim, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Kim Millward. I am the project manager for Nottoway County Economic Development, but I'm also this year's priorities chair.
Thanks, Kim. And we also have with us Josh McKim.
Yeah, hi, I'm Josh McKim. I'm with Nottoway County Economic Development, a longtime participant in Great Northwest Days, and excited for this one coming up in February.
Great, thanks, Josh. So today on the podcast, we're just going to go over each of the priorities. But before we get into that, just a little history on Great Northwest Days. This group is a group of leaders from 19 counties here in Northwest Missouri that come together each year to advocate together as one voice for the region of Northwest Missouri. So we meet many months in advance to talk about what issues we're dealing with, engaging with in our home communities, and we come together to bring forth those ideas and concerns to our state legislature. One of the neat things that makes this event really stick out is the collaboration we have between all our different counties and cities to really get a good grasp and represent our area thoughtfully. So during this event, we'll meet with the state legislators. We'll also have a very nice reception on the evening of February 3rd to showcase our counties as well as continue engagement. So with that, I think that wraps up kind of a context. Josh or Kim, do you have any other thoughts to share before we move on?
I would encourage anybody that is able to come to that February 3rd banquet. It's not just a normal sit down banquet. It is a great event. We usually have all of the different communities bring their best game and want to showcase their communities and showcase their counties, and would love to see as many people there as possible, because it is an opportunity for you guys just to learn a little more about what makes Northwest Missouri such a unique place.
And I would say also that afternoon we'll have a priorities panel. So you're more than welcome to come to the priorities panel and listen to us discuss 4 of the priorities that we have of the 6 that we're going to be talking about today. And listen to some speakers who will also be talking about some ways that communities have been addressing some of these issues locally, and ask some questions and hear some good ideas about how we can work together collaboratively to address these issues. But then I think the other thing that's really good about this that I want to make sure that we point out is that we've been doing this for a long period of time, and we've seen some success doing this. And so we want to talk a little bit, I think, some about that success. So one of the things that I think of that's been really successful from this that we've advocated for a long time has been broadband. So we were one of the first ones to talk about broadband and to talk about broadband needed to be accessible to everyone throughout the state of Missouri, no matter how big or small their community was. They need to have access to quality broadband. And so we're seeing the results of that now. With Missouri having a quality broadband plan in place that is going to be able to deliver money across the state and pinpoint those areas where we still have limited broadband access. And that was just one of the things that we've championed, I think, over the past almost 20 years that has been a benefit from this group. Any others that you guys can think of?
One other thing that I would probably point to as far as success was a piece of legislation that was championed and really written by Alan Andrews that kept local assessment of wind towers local under normal or under other assessment tools where other utilities are state assessed. where that means the revenues from those investments are spread across their service area. With windmills, it's different. With windmills, those windmills that are in your county, your community, are assessed locally, and those revenues stay there locally. That was one of those major issues that we were concerned with in Northwest Missouri because we've seen a lot of windmill development over the years, and keeping those local tax dollars local and really growing the impact, the positive impact of windmill development in our region was important to us. And so that's one of the other things I'd point to as far as success from Great Northwest Days.
Thank you for those comments, talking about our previous successes for Great Northwest Day. I think that's a great way to cap that. Moving on to 2026, we got a great number of issues we're going to be engaging the legislatures with. Real quickly, just to cover them, they revolve around expanding rural healthcare access, increasing childcare opportunities, investing in higher education and regional innovations, expanding workforce housing, ensuring sustainable tax reform, strengthening K through 12 education, and those are our priorities for 2026. So, to start off this conversation, we're going to spend a little time talking about our rural healthcare access. I think many of us who live in Northwest Missouri realize how important it is to have a local hospital or clinic within a close vicinity for where we live. Having those services being accessible it's really critical to ensuring good patient outcomes as well as improving our overall health, having those relationships with the doctors and nurses serving our towns. So with that, let's kind of just kick off a general discussion, Josh and Kim.
We've seen rural hospitals across the nation close over the last 20 years at alarming rates. If we were just looking at Missouri currently has about 57 rural hospitals. So of those, about a third of those are what we considered at-risk hospitals, meaning that their projections show that over the next probably 3 to 5 years, there's a significant risk of them going further into the red and potentially having to close their doors. In the last 10 years, we've lost 21 hospitals across Missouri, both rural and urban, with a good percentage of those being rural hospitals. Continues to be a major challenge for us to adequately address healthcare in rural Missouri. And if we don't do that effectively, there is a significant decline of general health and frankly quality of life in rural Missouri.
So Josh, is there any specific items that come to mind as to what might be impacting the rural hospitals at this time?
You know, as we look at that, you look at a shrinking population in rural Missouri, and geographically we become more and more spread out, and that becomes more and more of a challenge for these hospitals to provide the quality service that we need and that they want to provide. With a declining population, a population is further spread apart, makes it very difficult for them to do that. There's a number of other issues that are both at the federal and the state levels that, again, probably aren't in the areas that we can impact, but definitely something we need to continue to encourage our legislators to look at carefully as they consider what things they can do to support rural healthcare. I advocate that they look at it closely. And frankly, especially over probably about 3 or 4 different items, and we'll go into these in a little detail probably, but the ability for people to have access to dialysis providers. Dialysis is one of those essential needs you have to have, and if you're not aware, those centers have started to close considerably across rural Missouri, especially in Northwest Missouri. And it becomes where people now have to travel sometimes an hour or two one way in order to get those services. And those services are They're essential for their survival, but they're also something that they have to do regularly, depending on the level of care that they need. And so it adds considerable amount of time and energy, but also cost to the family. And it is definitely a major contributor to poor health in rural Missouri.
Yeah, I really do agree with that point, Josh, of the regular treatment. It can be a significant burden to a family, needing to find transportation and make the regular trip to and from the clinic. So that really is having local access really does stand out there.
I had a discussion when I first moved to Maryville and started doing economic development here. Early on, we had a discussion with some folks about what are some of the things that we really need in Maryville. What are some of the things that we should be focusing some of our efforts on? And the usual suspects arise, with different hotels or different restaurants or more retail. But one of the things that hit a lot, and it was a real surprise to me, was dialysis and having a dialysis facility. We had just lost our dialysis facility, and it had gone, well, it had closed. And so that was something near and dear to people's heart. And it didn't register with me because, again, I wasn't suffering from that. I wouldn't have to deal with that. But it didn't register with me as even something I would consider looking at until I heard from the public. And it wasn't one or two people, it was a number of folks that this should be a top priority.
So I think that's a really good point, Josh. And I want to go back to something Joe was talking about in terms of access and transportation and time for people. So not only when we think of dialysis, but when we think of things like chemotherapy or maternity care. When you think about the amount of time, if somebody is trying to work while doing those services as well, or somebody is trying to, as a family, is transporting them and is trying to work and doing those types of things. The amount of time that it takes to help transport that person is, a cost not only to their family, but it helps impact our community as well in terms of jobs and employers and trying to do goods and services and those types of things. And just having time to spend with your family and take care of your own mental health and do the things that keep your family together and growing together, being able to go to games and those types of things, or being able to do activities together. So it's really important. But when we really think about in terms of communities and growth, things like maternity care, which are so basic to being able to keep our population level or growing in a community, not to have maternity care locally where people have to go or drive 45 minutes or an hour or more to receive maternity care over a 9-month period while you're expecting, can be really detrimental to somebody wanting to have a baby. And especially if that person becomes high risk or is having some kind of complications, where they're having to go more frequently and they can't see a local provider as part of that care, that really becomes a detriment to that family, and makes that experience not a very positive one in some cases. And we always want that to be positive. A baby is a blessing. So we want that to make sure that we have that opportunity in our communities, to make sure that maternity care is one of those things that we have.
You hit on an important element because maternity care, about half of rural hospitals do not offer maternity care. And as a direct result of that, there is a statistically significant difference. More likely, people who are living in rural Missouri are statistically more likely to have complications in their pregnancy because of the distance to those services. So it is one of those issues that if we're not figuring out a way to address this effectively, we've made it much more difficult for women to have a safe birthing experience, for both the mother and the child. So you absolutely hit the nail on the head, is that transportation issue quickly becomes an issue, a major issue affecting health as well as affecting people's pocketbooks. So one of the other issues that we were talking about, and you mentioned, Cam, is mental health. We have moved from a mental health system where we institutionalize people and argue that's a great move. But what we've done is we've taken facilities that may have 2,000 or more residents and where have some type of treatment and then put them in communities and have not adequately equipped communities to provide those services, ongoing needed services for those folks who, again, we would want them in our communities, we want them in their homes, we want them with their families, but we need to make sure we're providing adequate services and support to those agencies who are desperately trying to meet those needs. A lot of it falls on our first responders. And Kim, you coming from a family of first responders, see this firsthand is the stress and the amount of strain it puts on our first responders, who frankly need to be given the tools and resources to provide those services, or at least, diminish the likelihood of major conflict happening.
Yeah, so first responders are oftentimes the first people that will receive a call to deal with a situation that is where a person is not at their best at that moment. The other group that we need to talk about, which is the people who maybe see those types of issues every day, are our educators who are dealing with students and parents every day, who also have to be equipped to deal with those types of situations. And that is not the things that they're often trained to do. That's not the reasons they go into these jobs. They go into because they want to help people and they want to teach children, and our first responders want to help people. But that mental health aspect is not the piece that they went into it to deal with every day. And so being able to have that training to know how to respond to those issues, to help de-escalate the situations and help that person find the services that they need is really crucial. And a lot of times, if people can't find those services they need, it is compounded sometimes because they then start turning to other things such as drugs and alcohol. And so that then escalates the situation even more. And those first responders then have another impact they have to deal with when they're doing those responses. And so making sure that we have adequate mental health and drug and alcohol treatment in our communities is important, and making sure that there's not a stigma around getting that treatment or seeking that treatment is very important as well, because there still is stigma around admitting that you have issues with your mental health and seeking that treatment.
Well, I think this has been really great conversation covering our healthcare opportunities here in the region. Let's move on to our next priority, increasing childcare opportunities. I think many of us in Northwest Missouri have seen just how difficult that at times it is to find childcare options. As a young father myself with children in the childcare daycare system, it's a real impact for me every day that I feel finding access to quality and affordable childcare really can be a challenge for not only me, but many young families in our area. So let's kind of get into this a little bit and kind of why has this become such an issue in the state of Missouri and in our area?
So I think more and more we realize that even from an economic development point, that this is really a key piece of our infrastructure for families to be able to go to work, for parents to be able to go to work. And that's difficult because oftentimes centers, to keep things affordable, operate on a shoestring budget. That includes oftentimes providers who are maybe a single provider in a home situation, taking keeping their fees low, paying themselves very little, keeping their costs low. If they're in a center, paying their employees very low, but being able to keep the costs of the center, paid. And really, that then makes it difficult for them to keep things going on a daily basis. And a lot of times I don't know that as a parent I saw necessarily. I saw it as a service, but I don't know that I necessarily saw it as a business at that time when my children were young. And it really is a business. And so for it to be affordable and quality, we really have to start looking at it as a business and as a key piece of our infrastructure in our community. And so that's hard for parents. But when you're making yourself maybe the same amount as maybe somebody who's making as a daycare worker and trying to balance your own family budget, that's hard as well. And so being able to afford to go to work and take your kids to childcare and know that they're in a safe place where you feel like you can leave them and concentrate on your job while you're there for 8 or 12 hours a day, and produce what you need to do for your job can be difficult for a family. And then make sure that you're also covering all of your expenses of a car and house, utilities and all those other things that you need to do, food, can be really difficult and can be even taxing for a family. So there's this really a double-edged kind of sword we have as a community of how do we make it affordable from a business standpoint, and how do we make it affordable for families? And so I think that's kind of where we're at, and a lot of communities are at, is trying to figure out how to make this work so that they can have affordable childcare in their communities.
I agree, Kim. It's one of those things that if we don't figure out a way for the childcare provider to make an adequate profit off of providing childcare, then all we've done is provide a short-term fix that ultimately will have to go out of business and then leave parents in the lurch. At the same time, if we're not adequately figuring out a way that it can provide the services at a reasonable cost to the parents, then we're only providing them with a short-term or no fix at all that they simply can't afford to do. It is one of the more difficult problems we're facing in workforce development in rural America, but in particular in rural Missouri. And it's one of those that's going to be very challenging. It's quickly becoming not just a economic development or a workforce issue. It's going to become a community issue at large, and it's going to impact our abilities to have vibrant rural communities that are poised for growth and hopefully a long-term sustainability.
Yeah. So even from a business aspect, as Josh and I have talked with daycare providers, just the amount of paperwork and regulation they must deal with. If they want to move from an unlicensed daycare facility to a licensed care facility, the amount of paperwork and time that it takes them to do that, and then trying to make sure that they have made it through all the hoops and the bureaucracy can be very time consuming and very frustrating. And so being able to look at those regulations and streamline those regulations is very important. One of our favorite stories that we've always had is from one of our dear friends, Mary Ingersoll, of talking about how when she was working on opening her facilities, that she would oftentimes have to have background checks done by 2 different agencies, even though if they were working already in one group, in another setting, and then if they were going to transfer to the after school care, they had to do it in another type of agency. And so things like that where people have to go and double up on type of things like that just really make it difficult for them. Being able to understand some of the regulations, or having to wait for people to come in and do inspections where there may be a long wait list to get that inspection done, because training people to be inspectors and then having the inspectors come in and not understanding all the rules and maybe them not all applying them the same can be difficult too, and make it very strenuous for those providers and very nerve-wracking and stressful. And just, some of the regulations that we have, like Josh and I have talked with providers about the ceiling height, preventing some of them from doing things, or, we understand that we want places to be safe, and we want kids to be in a safe environment, but making sure that things like, sprinkler systems over water heaters and those types of things, how does that impact the daycare and the cost that provider has to make their home go from unlicensed to licensed and the cost that they then have? And are they going to be able to recoup those costs with their fees? Same with, food costs. If they're providing food for the children, can they get some of that reimbursed through the different programs that are available? So having that kind of piece with business and being able to look at that can be very difficult for a provider. So anything that we can do to streamline and make it easier for a childcare provider to do the business side of the business and do what they really love, which is take care of the children and provide for the children, the better off we'll be.
Yeah, absolutely, Kim. Our state has worked very hard at being I would argue, a leader in the nation of being a business-friendly environment. And we've worked hard, and the state has worked very hard to identify those things that need to happen in order to make us more business friendly. What I would hopefully would love to challenge, but I'd encourage our state to do is to look at what are the things that we can do to be a leader in the nation at becoming a child care friendly environment as well, because it is a business, and the regulations and the paperwork is much greater than any other, almost every other business in the state and what they have to do. So it would be great if we could look at that. How do we streamline things? How do we make ourselves a leader in childcare provider friendly environment?
From the parent side, affordability is always going to be one of those things that you have to balance between safety and affordability with your budget. I don't know one parent that ever will say that there is a ton of money extra in their budget at the end of the month. And childcare is always going to be one of those things that you don't want to scrimp your budget on. But it's always hard when you hear some of these fees that we talk to parents about and have. And so figuring out a way to make that affordable for families, especially if they have more than one child and children under the age of 2, we have a huge deficit of childcare across Missouri for 2 and under because of the ratios that are needed within a childcare facility to care for those that age group for infants, that it just makes it very cost prohibitive sometimes for families even to think of considering having children. And so to make it as affordable as possible for those families is important. And so I think what Josh was kind of leaning into there was we're really supportive of Brenda Shields. Shout out to Brenda Shields, who is for the last, I think, 2 or 3 years, put forth a bill, House Bill 2409, which would allow for child care tax credits for the family, employers, and providers who are actively working to move, to a point where we can make that affordable. And so, Josh, do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Because you've been following that a little bit longer than I have for the last couple of years.
Yeah, what's nice about Representative Shields' bill is that it does try to hit all 3 of the major partners in child care providing. And traditionally, we look at child care interaction, a child or provision for child care, and as an interaction between parents and a child care provider. But the reality is, the third wheel of that is, or the third leg of the stool, or whatever you want to call it, is the employer themselves. And so what we're hoping this bill will do will both offset the costs to the parents with a tax credit, but would also encourage our employers to be more actively engaged in the providing of childcare, whether that's in their facility or in support of another facility, and then would encourage the childcare providers that are existing in our community to continue to expand their capabilities. So that's what the beauty of this bill does: is it hits 3 different segments of the childcare issue. Again, trying to provide a holistic approach in many ways to offsetting costs and encouraging more investment in childcare.
Yeah, guys, I think this has been really good. We've talked about some of the burdensome regulations, finding that balance with quality and affordability, but as well as identified some potential tools to help alleviate some of the costliness of providing service. So let's go ahead and move on to investing in higher education and regional innovation. Well, we are very blessed as a region to have three wonderful educational upper institutions that provide a variety of opportunities for young students. Institutions such as Northwest Missouri State University in Maryville, Missouri Western State University in St. Joseph, and North Central Missouri College, with locations in both Trenton and Savannah. So these are providing the talent pipeline for our next leaders and workforce, folks staying and working here in our region. So let's talk about the importance of these institutions and how that improves the life here in Northwest Missouri.
If you just look at the economic impact of these institutions, and you don't go into a lot of the other details, we're talking the economic impact for Northwest Missouri ranges in the hundreds of millions of dollars on an annual basis. And they're one of the hallmark, they're one of the most important business provider, or excuse me, employers in our communities. They're one of the most important providers of education and supplying and creating that workforce for tomorrow. One of our favorite professors at Northwest Missouri State University, Ben Blackbird, often says that they are training the workforce for jobs we don't know exist yet. And that's the mentality they're trying to take across Northwest Missouri, is that we want to prepare the next generation for opportunities that, again, we don't know about yet, but we know are coming. And so from a standpoint of, we want to encourage our legislators to continue to support higher education, because if you're looking at economic impact, one of the best investments we can make, and study after study shows that, is going to be in education. Long-term, sustainable economic growth happens when you invest in education. And so we highly encourage them to consider supporting and continuing to support higher education. In particular, there's some things that we believe are important. And one of those is to modernize our facilities. Education, the face of education is changing. And so our institutions need to be ready for those changes. And part of that is taking care of delayed maintenance that has happened over the time because of tight budgets, but also preparing themselves for what's next in education, and making sure that they're poised and very flexible enough to provide educational opportunities and services in an ever decentralizing environment. Kim right there is an example of how we see this decentralization of education. Kim, you now are taking online classes, right?
Yeah, so I just started 3 days ago the Masters of Public Administration program at Northwest Missouri State, totally online. So while we were talking earlier about younger students, don't forget those that are those of us that are lifelong learners, or those who maybe are doing some kind of career changes later in life due to changes in our economic environment. Because our three institutions do a great job of making sure that they are providing training, even though they may be what we would normally consider degree-seeking institutions. They do provide great training to our local employers to meet their needs, so that they can provide customized training to those institutions for our local employers. So, yep, currently back in classes.
And I think that's one important thing to point to, Kim, is that all three of these institutions have started to take a hard look at what's going on in the workforce, what are the needs of our employers across Northwest Missouri, and trying to work within, again, there are constraints in higher education, but trying to work within those constraints of higher education in order to provide training and skills that on day one can be used by our employers, both on the technical side and on the more traditional side of education. And so they've all transitioned to some degree in providing a much more technical support as well. So I'm excited about the direction of education, especially higher education, and what we're seeing, because what we're seeing is our institutions want to be on the cutting edge of providing education that is relevant to our employers. And so that's why we're highly encouraging the state to continue to support them, to look at how inflation is going to continue to increase their costs. And again, trying to match inflation so that our institutions can continue to innovate, continue to provide incredible services, cutting edge services, and education that is relevant, not just fun, but relevant education that is heart targeted at employer impact and impacting our employers as soon as the employees step on their site. The other program we highly encourage is the A plus program. We want them to continue to fully fund the A plus program. It's a great opportunity for those for students to really work down the cost of their education, and we support them wholeheartedly in that. And hopefully, so does the state legislature.
Yeah. A plus program is really a great way for students who are coming out of high school to maybe attend either, in our case, Missouri Western or North Central Missouri College, and really take those first 2 years of college education, or maybe get into a associate's program and graduate, and then go on later to a bachelor's degree program or a master's program, and really get what we call those stackable credentials. Really important in degrees like medical, nurses in particular have often stackable credentials. And so being able to start off at that RN, LPN phase, and work your way up, and then work and go to school at the same time, very similar to what I'm doing right now, is important in those medical fields because they have clinicals. And so being able to earn a wage while going to school is very important for a lot of families and a lot of individuals at the same time. And being able to do that at a institution where costs maybe are lower in tuition, and maybe they can then benefit from that before transferring to a larger university or going to a bigger program, really is helpful in Northwest Missouri to build that skill base, because we know not everyone needs to go to college, but we want to have a variety of options for everyone who does want to attempt to go to school and reach their goals.
I think that's great, Kim, that you bring up the tools that are available to students to further pursue education if they so choose. And I think we all recognize the value of continuing education, regardless of what that may look like and what that can bring in improving the lives of folks here in our region. Okay, I think we covered that well. So let's take a crack at expanding workforce housing. So looking at some of the workforce housing issues we face, we know from conversations with some of our community leaders that there just isn't enough housing available. Folks want to live in our towns and our communities, but there's just the inventory isn't there, and what inventory might be in existence isn't affordable for some of these folks looking for specifically this workforce housing. So, Josh, I know you've had some experience in working on workforce housing, and I would love to hear some of your thoughts and comments.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Joe. You know, labor markets are so very tight in rural Missouri, and that really goes across Northwest Missouri. That includes St. Joseph, Chillicothe, Cameron, Maryville, Trenton, Savannah. All you just named community after community. All of them are facing a workforce challenge, and part of that challenge we try to address in childcare, but part of that challenge is we've got to figure out how do we get more people here. And we believe we have great quality of life. People do want to move here. There's a significant amount of people that, in fact, a lot of my classmates would love to move back to the Maryville. But again, they want opportunity and they want housing. And one of those issues we've got to face is how do we deal with a workforce housing shortage? And when we talk about workforce housing, it used to be we call it affordable housing, and nobody could really define what that was. But the reality is we need housing that the workforce that we have here can afford and meets their needs, as well as something that's desirable to them. If we simply come up with ideas that is affordable but is not desirable, that doesn't really solve the problem. If we come up with ideas that are simply desirable but are not affordable, that doesn't solve the issue. And that's kind of the hard part about it is it's very difficult to provide housing that's both affordable and desirable. And so with that, we are encouraging that our state legislature and our governor can carefully consider how can the state help offset some of those costs so that affordability and desirability can be met in rural Missouri and in frankly across Northwest Missouri. There is a number of bills out there that have got some tax credits tied to them that again focused on how do we bring down those housing costs and make that more affordable to folks. We have a number of communities that are actively engaged in how do they trying to provide workforce housing. In fact, my board has made it a priority in 2026 to continue to focus on workforce housing. And how do we do that? How do we provide the resources that we need to builders? And how do we get builders to build affordable housing? And then how do we make sure that affordable housing gets to the right people or gets to folks ready and willing to buy? So this is a tremendous challenge. It's one that we've got to put some time and energy behind. So we're advocating for programs that expand housing development. We're also asking for programs that help revitalize existing housing. You know, that's one of the other things that we're facing is we have housing that might be available, but it doesn't really fit that desirability level. The level of maintenance hasn't been kept up. If you're in a college town, a lot of that housing has been transitioned to rentals, and over time now is maybe transitioning back. But there's a history of rentals, and the care for a rental house is different than the care for a home. And that means you might have to take walls out in order to make it more of a home. You may have to, divide out the rooms, do different things that have over time have been built out for multifamily housing or for rental housing. So having programs that help meet the need on the new housing as well as renovation of existing housing would be something that we add tremendously want to support. And I know there's support across Northwest Missouri, across Northern Missouri, and frankly, throughout all of Missouri to try to address this workforce housing issue because it's not just a rural issue. It's not just a Northwest issue. It's a issue across Missouri.
So Josh, I think you bring up some really good points, and especially, I think we all recognize the difficulty with higher construction prices and higher interest rates. I think has had an impact on getting some new housing developed. It seems to me some of the low-hanging fruit may be trying to revitalize some of this existing inventory. Are there any tools or tactics we could be trying to implement in our towns to help kind of kick this process off?
Well, I think that from a standpoint, if we were looking at how do we deal with renovation of existing or rehab of existing facility or buildings, homes, we've got to figure out ways that we get rid of those homes that are undesirable, that are beyond repair. And that there's some beauty, there's some community beautification that has to happen. We have to make our communities desirable. So one of those steps is getting rid of those houses that are substandard and are not going to be able to be rehabbed. That's not what we're talking about today. What we are talking about is how do we take those homes that are still have a lot of good life left in them and bring them up to a standard that folks want to be in. From our standpoint in Maryville, we in the past have utilized some of our locally controlled economic development loan programs to help homeowners renovate their homes. That's not something we do all the time on a regular basis, but that is one tool that we've used that we have local control over. Again, trying to help and figure out ways that we can bring down the costs of renovation. And when I talk about our local loan programs, generally that's a below market or a 0% interest loan that we control locally. Not everybody has that tool. Some communities do, some don't. But if your community does have that tool or does have a foundation that might buy into this, that's another thing that we've taken advantage of. We have a local community foundation, the Rickard Trust, that has helped us with some of our housing programs. And we applied to them for funding in order to help offset some of the costs for housing development. That's something else I'd encourage communities to consider doing, is looking at those kind of funding sources that, again, may not be the traditional funding sources from the local community, but can be used to help offset costs and bring down those expenses.
I think the difficult part about housing for a lot of communities is that many of us have not developed a subdivision in probably 30 years or more. And so to go back and think about in terms of planning, zoning, financing, that type of a development is difficult. And so tools that would be available to help a community do that, I think would be very welcomed from the state level, from the federal level, just because we are not alone in Northwest Missouri. I listen to, Josh can tell you, city council meetings from all across the United States. And housing is an issue across the nation. And nobody has, I don't think, at least the ones I'm listening to, are facing the same struggles we are in terms of trying to figure out housing and development and costs. Because I think one of the things that we see, and one of those other places that I think makes it difficult to do housing, is the infrastructure cost if you're going to do a new development. To put in the roads, the electricity, the water, those costs right there can stack up quickly and kill a development project really quick in terms of affordability.
Yeah, Kim, you hit the nail on the head. We've got a project here that as we tried to work through infrastructure costs, you started to approach $100,000 a lot just in infrastructure costs, and that's before we do any real digging on the lot or putting any sticks on the lot, any kind of building at all. So when you start to run into those numbers, and if we don't have a way to offset those numbers, it makes it almost impossible to do workforce housing. That automatically pushes you into the next bracket to where you're doing customized homes and some other things that, again, great margins for our builders, but aren't necessarily helping us address some of the bigger issues we've got.
What legislation is going through this session that may be able to help us address some of these issues we've been talking about?
Well, Representative Sharp has a couple different pieces of legislation that he's introduced that I think are trying to hit on helping to provide workforce housing in rural areas. I think it's House Bill, let me see, 1715 and House Bill 1716. I think those two try to address by providing tax credits for redevelopment. So those would be a couple that I would encourage people to watch and maybe have some input on.
Yeah, and then I believe Senator Jason Bean on the Senate side has a companion bill to Senator Sharp's bill for housing. So that would be the other one I think to watch.
Great. We'll definitely have to keep an eye on that this session, and hopefully we'll continue to see some more development on some of these workforce housing opportunities. All right. Next, we're going to talk about some of the tax reform efforts that are being discussed in the legislature. We're hearing a number of different ideas being promoted in the legislature. Things from moving away from the income taxes that we pay to the state, moving towards a sales tax form of revenue.
Mm-hmm.
Also, some legislation being proposed of taking a look at personal property tax and property taxes. So I think this is a really important subject that we take a little dive into. Kim, how about you kick us off?
Yeah, so sounds like Texas is going to be the hot issue when we are in Jefferson City in February, and really this whole legislative session. And it's very important. Um, I can say that as I talk to my friends and family, most of us can all agree that we want to keep as much of the money that we have and that we're earning here locally. And we feel that we're the best people to say how we can spend our money. But we also like to have services in our community and be able to help provide services on all the levels that we currently have now. And so trying to figure out a way to modernize our system and be able to keep the levels of services that we expect is important to us. And to make sure that we're able to do that is going to take some time and some effort from everyone to sit down and really look at this issue and make sure that we are figuring out a good path forward for that. So I think one of the key things for us as we look at this from a local standpoint as a contingent that's coming down, we just want to make sure that because we do have a lot of small communities, when we look at taking away the personal income tax and moving to more of a personal property tax or a sales tax, and then when we talk about changes particularly in property tax and how that might impact things here locally, we want to make sure that we're protecting our local revenue streams and options for communities and what they can do and how they fund local government. You know, Maryville is in a unique position, and Chillicothe and some of our larger communities where they have the ability to use sales tax and maybe transient gas tax. Sales tax and some of those other taxes that are available to help fund government. But when we get to some of our smaller communities, the opportunities are less than what's coming in from maybe the state or a property tax. So we want to make sure that there are options for them to make sure that those services that they have, that they are providing to their citizens, still can be provided, because there is a certain expectation of the level of services that we have. You know, part of the reason that we like living in our rural communities is the quality of life we have. And so part of that is we have, 9 rural school districts, maybe in Nottoway County. Well, we like having our local school district here where our kids don't have to travel very far to go to school. We like having our ambulance districts being able to have, people who can respond in our local communities. We like having fire districts that can help respond in our communities if we have a fire or those types of situations. So having what we consider essential services that are there when we need them is an important component for us. And so making sure that we're able to fund those services and having mechanisms to do those, especially when those are reliant oftentimes on property tax, is important for us to make sure that as we're making changes or looking at changes to that we have mechanisms or opportunities for communities to look at other ways that they can fund those, because oftentimes our small communities don't have a lot of businesses in them. So if we're going to look at a sales tax only model, that may not be the best opportunity for some of our smaller communities to maintain their levels of service. So definitely want to look at that. So as we go through this process, definitely stopping, thinking, looking at that, assessing what the direct impacts would be on all levels of communities as we go through this is going to be really important and vital as we move forward as a state.
Kim, I think you hit the nail on the head in that this is a very challenging conversation. It's a very challenging issue because I, for one, and I know most of Missourians like to pay less in taxes. I mean, why wouldn't we? But at the same time, there's this great balance we have to have in that we pay less in taxes. That could impact what kind of services we get, or how those services are provided, or how our local ambulance district survives. How does our local schools continue to provide great education? How does the senior center continue to reach out and impact seniors' lives and give them a great quality of life as they head into their twilight years? So how do these things happen if we continue to look at how do we cut taxes? So I think that assessment's important, is that as we, again, I think we'd all advocate for lower taxes. But as we advocate for lower taxes, what's the societal impact we're going to have to deal with, and assessing what kind of impacts cutting taxes, whether that be the personal income tax, personal and corporate income tax, or whether that be the personal property tax. Again, cutting those, what's that going to do to local services, especially in rural Missouri? And frankly, are there other ways we can fund those? So yeah, maybe it's not the same way it once was. And again, I think that's one of the things we have to be as a region, as a state, is we have to be willing to change, and we have to be willing to look at alternatives. And so what other alternatives are there out there to the corporate income tax and the personal income tax, funding a lot of our local community and state programs? You know, what's some of the other options out there to funding education or the senior center than personal property? So what are those other things that we can do, and making sure we've got a plan in place to provide those services, continue to provide those services at a great quality of life level while also lowering our taxes. I love that idea. I'm glad you guys have that challenge, because that's a hard one.
It's a
And I'm
very hard
excited
one.
to see what kind of ideas you guys come up with as you kind of wade through this tremendously challenging issue.
I think it is going to take looking at things differently. I mean, when I think of the way in which we used to fund things previously, 911 used to be funded through your phone bill. And as the number of phone bills, number of phone connections in home, landlines have gone down.
Yeah.
We've had to look at other mechanisms to fund that. I think the one the governor talked about yesterday, which kind of hit me a little, was like, oh, that's going to be hard, was, taxing digitized services. The first one he mentioned was ebooks. I read 310 ebooks last year, people. I'm a Kindle Unlimited. So, I maybe pay $16 a month for a subscription to read certain books. That's what I pay. So I'm like, how would that affect me? Is it worth it to me to pay extra, maybe $1 a book so that I can have those services paid? Possibly, it's cheaper than buying the full book, and hard copy. Though I will tell you, I kind of cringed when I bought my textbooks digital, because they were still in the $80-$90 range. But, thinking of how do we look at things that weren't available to us even 20 years ago, are available now for this new digital economy, as he called it, are things that I think we have to look at. What are the other options that we have? Because that really becomes then of a model of, if you're buying that particular service, then you do pay that tax. Very much like what we used to call the cigarette tax. Remember that? If you were willing to buy the cigarettes, then you paid the extra tax on that. You paid the penalty tax for buying those. And so very much like that. Yeah, I would give extra money to buy ebooks, or to purchase an ebook, to help fund certain services if I knew what that was going for. If it's going to the general fund, that's fine. But if I also knew it was going to fund my local library, even better.
So I think it's good that we're having these conversations on taxes and kind of seeing what makes sense, in today's world versus how we've been doing it in the past. Is there any pieces of legislation right now that we should be paying attention to throughout this session?
Yeah, one I could tell you on the House side that I'd probably be paying a little bit of attention to is House Bill 2690. Is set to replace the personal and corporate income tax and estate tax with a sales tax, which is an interesting concept and something that I would recommend people kind of do a little more research on and look at and maybe make some comments on.
Great. Well, I think we've covered the bases on that topic. And to wrap things up, let's spend a little time talking about K-12 education. Talk about some of the highlights as well as opportunities and things to be thinking about this next legislative session?
So, yes, thank you, Joe. As I've said before, if a community, if a county, if a state wants to do effective economic development, long-term effective economic development, the best investment they can make is in education. And the best investment, and particularly the earlier you make that investment, the more impact it has. And that's proven across board. Study over study after study has shown that education is probably the best single investment we can make with public dollars into economic development. That being said, we know there are lots of considerations and lots of challenges that you guys are facing at the state, and a lot of questions, big questions, you're trying to effectively address with public education. What I would encourage you to consider is that taking a one size fits all approach could adversely affect rural Missouri and rural education. In rural settings, we have limited access to education, meaning that in some communities we have one option. In some communities, you have no option. You have to go somewhere else to get it. In Nottoway County, we have several school districts that service multiple communities. And so what we're advocating is that as you consider how to fund and how to move forward with education, that you fully fund the foundation formula so that it protects rural school districts and keeps rural education intact. Without a consideration to that, it could impact our ability to effectively educate our kids in Northwest Missouri and in rural areas. So we're encouraging you guys to consider that as you go forward, making sure that we continue to have access to great quality education in a limited access environment, meaning we don't have more than one option than public education. And the other thing we'd encourage you guys to, as you work forward, to carefully consider any legislation that has some impact on the ability for local schools and local school boards to provide that education. Some of those questions you guys are addressing go beyond that, but there are some that could impact the ability to provide education. So we encourage you guys to continue to consider those things as you're going throughout this legislative session.
All right. Well, I think we had a really good conversation over all these priorities today. I think we hopefully accomplished our goal in giving you all a good primer into some of the issues we've been learning about over the last few months. I think a good opportunity for folks that are interested to continue to further that learning is through our priorities panel we host every year at Great Northwest Days. This year it'll be the afternoon of February 3rd, and Kim is going to talk to you about our priority panelists we have lined up.
Yeah, so we're going to cover 4 of the priorities that we've talked about today. During that, we've asked some really great speakers to come and share with us during that time some of the challenges, but also some of the best practices they know about that are happening across Northwest Missouri to help solve the issues that we are talking about. So we have Dana Anderson, who is the Chief Operating Officer from Mosaic Medical Center here in Maryville, is going to come talk about healthcare issues. Dr. Carolyn Chrisman with Chrisman Consulting, and she's the owner of that, who has been working in the childcare space, who will talk with us about childcare opportunities and how we can increase those across Missouri. Derek Weber, who is the Executive Director of Northeast Regional Planning Commission, who has been working in the workforce housing space and the efforts he's been doing with his communities and the projects he's been doing in workforce housing. He's going to discuss those with us. And then lastly, Brian Grace, who is a partner at the Nexus Group, is going to talk with us about tax reform, both on the personal property as well as the income tax side, and give us a really good explanation of things that we need to be considering during that time and things to look for as we go through this legislative session. So it should be a really good time where we have 4 experts who are able to kind of give us a little bit more in depth on those priorities and talk about some best practices, and then have some good question and answer and discussion with each of those individuals.
Well, thank you, Kim, for highlighting those folks. And And just to repeat, we're really looking forward to further exploring these important priorities we've been discussing today. And just one last housekeeping item. Of course, February 3rd, Tuesday night, is our annual banquet. So we hope to see everyone there able to attend to visit with folks traveling from Northwest Missouri, as well as we'll be announcing the Northwest Missouri Citizen of the Year Award. So lots of good things to look forward to Tuesday night. As we wrap up, any last words from Kim or Josh?
No, I just thank you all for taking the time to listen through this. Hopefully, we've given you guys a little bit to think about. And also, if you do have any follow-up questions or concerns or recommendations, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. We do think we appreciate the opportunity to get in front of you and kind of share some of our thoughts. So thank you.
Yeah, and I would just like to thank Northwest Missouri State University's Career Services Department. They are helping us with our post-production of our podcast and helped us with our pre-production. This is the first time, I think, for the three of us that we've been on the producing side of trying to do a podcast. I think many of us have been guests, but it's a little different when you're working on producing that and coming up with the content. So we are very appreciative of them helping us through this first podcast.
That's great. Now I think we could all say we've enjoyed being a part of this production, and like I said, hopefully you all find some value in it as well. And I want to thank you for your time and look forward to seeing you at Great Northwest Days.